How's it going, Julian?
Yeah, it's good. Um, let's say interesting week, but I don't know precisely what was interesting about it. But I had like a bunch of really kind of just good coffee chats with
Nice.
people. Like there was a lot of like kind of unexpected overlap and intersections with just things been thinking about and working on, and met some new people who I was like genuinely surprised that I hadn't met them before because they're like quite close by accidentally, like it was just one of those kind of fun things. And then um
You're in the right area for it, that's for sure.
I guess I don't know, I don't always think so, but yeah, sometimes it turns out that way. There's some conversations about like about that started with one friend who I talked to, who you look at it and it's like, wow, that always thought you had like a really kind of awesome job, and then you find out it's actually not that awesome. It's just the title sounds awesome, but it's like filled with all kinds of challenges. And anyway, she was just like sharing with me. It led to some conversations about kind of new or other ways of working broadly. I mean, just kind of generally speaking, like what are configurations of people coming together to do things that are maybe better, more effective, and so that led to like there was just like these two other conversations that I had were like completely separate. Actually, one was a kind of webinar that I popped into really unexpectedly. Like I saw notes like, oh, this is happening. Had no idea what it would be, but it was like one of those things where Nicholas, it was in the WhatsApp group, and
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
using your algorithm now for dealing with that. 643 messages. So
I can't tell you what it is. It's too much.
I just scroll through it, and if something catches my eye. If it doesn't, forget it. But it caught my eye that because it was happening. This webinar was happening in 40 minutes or that kind of thing, and I was like, all right, well maybe I'll like that'll be like listening to like radio or something. Like I won't, and so I turned it on, tuned in, and it was at first I was almost gonna be like, oh, this isn't for me. It was almost like I was being given exercises. And I'm the kind of guy like with like workshop and stuff, like I'm really not into the let's stand up and stretch and do yoga kinds of breaks. Like I'm just not into it. I'm like, let's do the thing. It's just me personally. And I saw it was like the equivalent of that, and I was like, oh, I'm just gonna kind of ignore that part. But it was just simple things basically. And then they had a guest, this guy, Scott Cohen from a place called New Lab in New York. Scott, do you
Yeah,
know him? Know of him?
I've actually heard his name before as well.
New lab, yeah.
Yeah. I didn't, I mean, this was after my day and I just didn't really keep up with what was going on. And he was the guy who was like going to share. And it was just amazing. It was just really, I think it was less exactly what he does and did, and more just him as a kind of human being. Because some of a couple of notes that he hit that were really resonant. So he talked a bit about the way they work, and there was I guess they were one of the organizations that did a bunch of stuff uh with hey Nicholas, can you do me a favor? Nick is asking how to get into Zoom. Can you maybe find him in Slack?
Okay, I have him. I
Yeah.
have him.
Head of design at Google X. Anyway, he was talking about this work they did to manufacture ventilators when that was like a real kind of crisis, um, and I kind of appreciate that, like let's just get it done and figure out who the right people are. Like there was that kind of sentiment, and then he also was reflecting on this that the way the way he framed it, that New Lab works, it's like um, it's almost like the opposite of the typical Silicon Valley innovation. Like let's figure out how we can make as much money as possible by doing this thing and doing just it was a different framework, and the way I interpreted or wanted to hear the kind of framework that it was like very much more like we find the people who are, really kind of innovative and are used to working in a kind of very dynamically formed kind of way, and we bring them to, we bring them to a task, or maybe they define the task, and then it kind of proceeds, but not within the framework of like a typical, um, startup with all the kind of extra crap that kind of goes along with that, like how much equity do I have, and who's in charge, and like egos and like all this kind of stuff. It was, I'm sure like on the ground it's very, very different, but the way he was describing it, that kind of idea resonated with me. This idea of like a network of operators who come together, um, you know, work because they have particular expertise and are motivated because they enjoy, kind of process and solving problems. And he also described, he said like, part of his ambition around it. I'm probably getting a lot of like his role and responsibility maybe a little bit off, but the idea that resonated was that you could, have really good work happen in this kind of networked way. You don't need the structure of a corporation and its kind of organizational infrastructure in order to do good work. And he was like telling companies that if you want, these are the people to do the job, and they don't want to work for you. Funny thing, but they will do the work. And so you need to figure out and get used to working in this other fashion. And that was really resonant. And again, I'm just, huge. I'm like, I just listened to the guy, so I didn't really dig into it. And I've never even been, even though I used to live like half a mile from the Brooklyn Navy Yard, I never have been there, didn't experience it. But these are the things.
That's where
Mm.
that's where Chris and Elliot are
Right.
set up. Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds good. Like the spiel about it sounds really different than what it's like to go there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an impressive place. And the individual organizations that are in there essentially pay a subsidized rent, I believe.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the process of being admitted, if there is one other than being able to pay. You may have to like qualify based on the kind of work you do.
Yeah.
But they are good at, I mean, I will say for most things of that nature, they are very good at telling the story of what's going on. So
Yeah.
if you're someone who's in there, the promotions that they do or the events that they put on are quite good. The production quality and like the fact that you're impressed by this guys speaks to their ability to draw an audience for what's happening.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing he was saying was that it's, I mean, it sounded like there were also some internal challenges. I mean, just in terms of,
It's a shame that Nitsan isn't here. Apparently he knows them. So maybe you'd have more insights.
sorry, what was that, David?
I was saying that Nitsan Herman, he
Okay.
so he might know more, but he's not here today. So
Yeah. I mean, it was, and then there was also, I mean, I think a lot of what he was saying that appealed to me. He also had this kind of like humility to him, I guess. I don't know how to describe it. Like just this, he, he's like, let's say he's a senior guy, like he's accomplished a lot. He's kind of founder of this organization, done a lot of different things. And the crowd, like the rest of the webinar was, I guess more kind of like mid-career and junior people. And so they kind of like would earnestly ask him questions, and he would kind of respond with a certain sense of humility. And then he would ask in a very genuine way. It's like, so what do you do? Like it was a curiosity as opposed to just, I'm going to tell you things and I'll explain to you how the world works and these kinds of things, which I really appreciated. I gotta help the head of design at X try to get onto Zoom.
Tried two as well, didn't work.
Yeah, weird. Authorized attendees only. I'm just gonna go on mute for a second if you guys want to talk amongst yourselves. Nicholas has some really
There he is.
Oh, it worked. It worked, Julian.
Oh, gone again.
Who were you guys talking about earlier? I just joined, so I missed it, but it sounded like an interesting session.
Yeah, it was this webinar or, something of that description that I happened to like last minute noticed and joined yesterday, the day before, something like that. And it was just it just resonated. I was expecting it I wasn't expecting anything, and it just kind of stuck with me and hung with me in a fascinating way. A guy called Scott Cohen, and I'm trying to remember the name of the organization that put it together, or studio. But it just resonated because he hit two topics that are kind of near and dear. One is like, kind of ways of organizing groups of interesting creative people to come together around a project and then maybe disperse. And the other one was kind of the inverse of that, is like there have to be ways of working that are not just, I got to join this company and sort of then be whatever, like all the organizational like kind of friction. It's all the friction that comes with like an organization of that is called a corporation. Can we get rid of that? Because it oftentimes doesn't help, and it adds a lot of you do things like show up at a meeting just to be there and be seen. And then I had a call with another fella. And it was still ringing in my head, and we were kind of talking, this kind of a meet and greet, and I was, we were both reflecting on that. So someone, like with a, again, you look at the job description, it's like, wow, amazing job, like awesome, like, and they're like, yeah, it's a cool gig. It's like, I mean, you should see my calendar. It's just like 30 minutes of these kind of like almost pointless meetings. It's like it's like, finally 3 o'clock rolls around. It's like, okay, can I do some work now? And you just wonder about where all that energy goes to, and is it all necessary, or is only 10% of it necessary, or can there be kinds of organizations which vaguely is like the rough idea of a near future laboratory, where it's you have a couple of like pillars that kind of hold the tent up, but then other people kind of come in and circulate in. And then they're like, okay, right, I'm done. I'll see you later. Let me know if anything else comes up. And they might not become involved in anything, or even the project they were working on for like, see you in 3 months or something like that. And it just seems like there's a category or a kind of personality that works much better and more efficiently, and in a more like in a self-indulgent way. Like it's more satisfying for that person, for me or for you or whoever, to work in that mode, because then it's like, great, now I'm gonna, I know I'm probably not gonna do anything else on this project, or the only thing I'm gonna do for the next like 60 days is work on my novel, or whatever. And that's as rewarding and satisfying, and that's as important and significant in terms of your, one's ability to do creative work as it is to sit in a meeting for 30 minutes and talk about HR issues, or listen to all hands kind of thing, or all the kinds of stuff that's really easy to make fun of.
I think there can be a productive hybrid, between those two modes of thought. I think that there's a huge assumption of like a massive amount of responsibility, and that it requires a very specific personality for, I think, someone to be able to walk away from a project and have it kind of on the back burner. So I think that making that entire process more accessible to people, and one way of doing that is definitely with a shorter work week. That seems like it's an automatic way to kind of fulfill some of the objectives of, I guess, like your ideal work environment, but for everyone, where you start maximizing free time in other ways. So that makes sense.
Sort of like, like what's in between, like, never really being able to do, being in that kind of architecture, and the sabbatical, which is like, this other friend who I was talking to was like getting ready to take a sabbatical. And it's like, so this is gonna be amazing and be able to do all this work, but it's like, why isn't that happening like continuously? Like why isn't there a sabbatical like I don't know, like
Hmm.
every Friday or something like
Mhm.
that. Or
Well,
every other month.
yeah, at Accenture, years ago when I worked there, I remember one of the partners was saying that a lot of it had to do with people's personal styles and working preferences. You know, he said we've got thoroughbreds, right? You know, sprinters who will, you know, run a race and win it and then rest. And then there's the percherons, right? The draft horses who will just plug along. And one of the, you know, once this concept was made explicit, then it became part of the way projects were staffed, right? And we realized that, you know, we had like subject matter experts who would rock up to like a processor engineering project and walk through a factory over the course of a couple of days and come back and say, look, here's the 10 things you have to do, right? And which turned out to be the right things. Or you could throw a team of, you know, 5 junior associates and they'd grind along for 3 months and they'd come up with something that might not be as good as what, you know, the sprinter did, right? And so there was this balance of like, you know, so what part of the project needs, you know, an army of associates to crunch through stuff, and what parts of it could benefit from just having a sprinter come in. And then because there were issues with mixing those up, you know, you could have like a bunch of people grinding away when what was really needed was creative insight, and it wouldn't happen. Or you could take your sprinter and allocate them for 3 months full time to a project because it was important, and they'd get really bored. So part of it might be to do with like personal preference and working styles.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally get that. Yes,
Mhm.
it's definitely not for everyone.
Yeah.
'Cause some people, you know, like they enjoy and they thrive in the in the architecture that is
Yeah.
kind of established. But it also every time I imagine the person who thrives, I think of that movie Office Space, and I think of like the one character who's always sitting there with the mug, and he's always asking me, "Hey, when can I get that BD7-12? I don't need you to work on that. Yeah, get that right away." It's, you know, just it's a cartoon, but it
Mhm.
definitely resonates. And so related, because it was maybe you know, just obviously these thoughts were in my head, and the calls were all happening almost on the same day or adjacent days. Was I kind of got cold called by this by one of these kind of like uh, network agencies of some description, where it's like we have a roster of folks, and we plug them in. And so I was listening very closely to kind of how that works, and why that works. And there was, you know, some of the descriptions of like of it were very much centered around like the you know, essentially how they pitch it to their clients, which is like, hey, you've and you know, forgive anyone who works or currently works or has friends who work at the big agencies, whatever. You called in like Frog, and they charged you like $500,000, and actually what you got was like a, you know, 12-page PowerPoint deck. Feels unsatisfying. Feels like you should have had more, doesn't it? And they say like for, you know, for like a, you know, a tenth of that or less, we can bring in, you know, well-seasoned experts who, you know, a nice pedigree of having worked at places of import, and essentially in a 2-week sprint, um, you know, help you define your problem, and provide you with like whatever 3 possible trajectories for solving it,
Mhm.
and all done in a couple of weeks. And here are the people who are going to be on the team. And I guess the 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 part of the selling point is that oftentimes you'll go to like a big name agency, and you will get the junior graphics designer,
Mhm.
even though the partner pitched. And part of the
Mhm.
negotiation is often like, I mean, I've been on these on the client side. It's like, okay, so who's going to work on it? Like, you know, and that'll be written in the contract that the partner is going to be spending
Mhm.
a minimum of 10 hours a week on it, or whatever it is. And I think this makes it a little bit easier. And also, you know, like I've been, you know, more recently with one client I'm working with a little bit, just noticing like how like earnest the work can be from like a big agency, but also how bad. Just kind
Mhm.
of, and I don't mean it's just like not thorough. It just feels like, really, for that.
Yeah, I've noticed that in the consulting firms too, you can definitely tell the difference between having an intervention by someone who knows their stuff versus they threw a bunch of consultants who might be very smart, and motivated, but had to research it from scratch. There's often blind spots and lagunae that, someone who actually knows the subject would have been able to pick up on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but you're but you're right, and like with creative work, you definitely see shocking issues. There's so many times when the pitch is far better than the deliverable.
Yeah.
Right, because the pitch is more creative, they involve more senior people, and then they turned it over to a team that basically just ground away and did something kind of functional but not inspired.
Yeah.
I think that's called bait and switch, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
to me, it also shows like a lack of iteration opportunities.
Yep.
Because a lot of times you're trying to implement more and more features, and like this, especially for like hardware products, where you're trying to create a gizmo with so many functions, and so you promise in the pitch a bunch of ideas, and then as you go along, of course, problems compound in some cases, and this seems to be like a really common. I remember, in college, just like how many pitches were like this. You would see if people just run these little roadblocks, and they would either kind of like kludge it into being a feature, or it would just not be present, and they would just, we forgot about that idea or decide that wasn't feasible. And a lot of it's just not enough time, not enough resources, poor communication for the hardware sphere globally. It's really easy to collaborate on software now, but it's really hard to collaborate on hardware. And I think that all that, compounds into that problem. Whenever it's like a digital product, that seems always just to be like time, weird.
Yeah, I guess iteration, it's either experience, someone who's seen things a lot of times, or iteration that gets you to some kind of polish, right? And I guess experience in some ways is sort of an abstraction of iteration, right? Someone who's been through multiple iterations of a similar problem. Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, I was thinking of the Accenture case that I knew, and it was a process re-engineering thing in a factory in Turkey. And like I said, there'd been an army of interns. They looked at everything, and they had a sense of what needed to be done. And this guy just walks through. He goes through one morning, looks around, comes back, meets the team, and says, "Okay, here's what's going to happen, right? The painting operation and the place where they put the seats in are out of sequence. So when they put the seats in, they scratch the paint and they need to rework it. So you just need to swap those steps, and that's a 20% increase in throughput right there." And there were a couple of things like that, right? And this was just from walking around, because the guy had seen everything before. And it's possible that the team of junior associate could have gotten there over time, but you don't know if they're going to have enough time.
I've seen that many times, and the question isn't that it's easy to observe what's wrong, it's why has it persisted in being wrong for so long?
Yeah.
So that expert I used to always say to clients, your dashboard tells you you're speeding, but it doesn't make you slow down. So just because you are able to point out, here's how it should be different, that's why the question is, why is the culture of the organization not making the change?
Yeah, and sometimes there's lock-in to bad decisions, or suboptimal decisions that no one ever questions. I've seen that happen more than once, where you start designing something and you come up with something that, okay, this works, and you iterate on it and you iterate on it and it converges. And then like suddenly you're like, wait a minute, going back to first principles, right? Is this really what we wanted? And you realize that the accumulation of design changes over the course of several iterations actually led to something that was not optimal. You know, I've been I've seen a couple of good examples of that where things get, you know, locked in, right? I mean, I worked on the Bay Lights, designing this clip to attach the LEDs to the cables, and you know, we started with this system of like these channels, so we ended up with a clip that was sort of a right angle thing, and then that right angle shape, that square shape, stayed part of the design until at some point I was like, wait, we got rid of the channel that the things ride in. Why don't we just make a curve that fits on the cable, right?
Yeah. I mean, there was a story, was it Uber's redesign, Airbnb's redesign, the logo? People are like, you spent all that time and this is what you got. And then the story came out that internally, I forget there was a like obstruction essentially by leadership around allowing the team to explore certain, I'm generalizing because I don't remember the details, but there was the culture in which all the work was getting done only surfaced because it was so dysfunctional. But for all these cases where you see quote unquote bad work, it's rare that the commissioning organization gets blamed. And they are often the reason, because they're part of why they're hiring somebody else is because they haven't figured it out themselves yet. When having done this for a long time, being that third party that's coming in, you're like, okay, well, I'm not the first person to tell you this, so why haven't you listened before? Even in the glaring clarity of evidence, you still haven't changed. Something's up. And then trying to find, that's therapy. Like you're trying to find out like what's going on that you aren't changing your mind.
That's that old Deming kind of rubric about the system is delivering the results that the system is designed to deliver.
Yeah.
Intentionally or no, that's what it's designed to do.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what you're wanting to do today, Julian, but like, it's part of why I've introduced foresights into my practice as a way to be like, all right, well, you've clearly been spinning on doing things this way for however long. Let's imagine other alternatives to that and different versions of yourself that you could be to highlight that you haven't made that change. I was like, oh, okay. So that's been incredibly effective. Either they only think a year out because they're risk averse, like it's a COO's in the CEO spot, for example. When you're like, yeah, you're supposed to be thinking 5 or more years out and you're coming from operations, so you're too near term, for example, or whatever it is, whatever their thing that they care too much about is in the way of seeing other alternatives.
I would love to hear about this zine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's thanks for all that other discussion. That's good stuff. It's definitely a through line of things that we're kind of trying to puzzle through. So yeah, we did this COVID zine, and it was all, if there's any blame to be placed, put it on Nick Foster, who in a wonderful way just kind of motivated us to kind of gather together around this. He was the orchestrator of the endeavor. And so Nick is with us this morning in cubicle number 6. So he'll lead a just kind of like why we did this and what's going on. And Nicholas and I will chime in as appropriate. Nick, how do you want to do it? Do you want to share screen kind of thing?
Yeah, can I do that as a non-licensed presenter or whatever it is?
I think so. It says allow participants to share screen, so you should be able to click the button.
Let me know. Does that sound good?
There it is. Oh my God. Amazing.
Professional.
Yeah.
I don't know. I could go long on this, but probably best to go short and have more of a chat than a presentation. So we've done a zine before, a zine called The User Experience Will Be as Shitty as Expected. And Nicholas Nova, who's on this call, was kind of he has a habit of taking these particular types of photos, observations of the world, particularly down at the mundane level or the strange behavioral level, as a double PhD endowed anthropologist and researcher of the future. But we had this collection of images on our hard drives, and we just thought, let's bring them together because this is a really good record of the way the world looks. You know, we have this habit at the Near Future Lab to focus on the future mundane, you know, the telling stories about the future in a grounded way, and recording the present is a good way to remind people that although we live in a world of whiz-bang technology, we're also surrounded by broken things and dongles and things that don't work fully all the time. So that was a zine that we did a while ago. And obviously around sort of January, February of this year, the world experienced a huge sort of shift in what was going on and then the way we did things. And I just realized that I was taking a ton of these photographs again of the way the world looked. So I sent an email out, or whatever it is, a Slack message. Is there a collective noun for Slack messages like tweets? A sleet? A slackist? I don't know, something. I sent a thing out saying we should collect all these things together. And in the act of doing that, the joy of the Near Future Lab is we're distributed, you know, all over the world, from Zagreb to Geneva to Venice to where I am in Oakland. So we're able to sort of see the world from many different places concurrently. And it's sort of this thesis started to appear that one of the things we like to do to create design fictions is take kind of existing archetypes or existing normal things and reproduce them, but with slight changes and tweaks. So take the tropes of that archetype, modify them slightly so they tell a different story about the future. But it felt like the things that were normal felt more like fictions in this sort of strange, rapidly changing, COVID-infested world. So we wanted to kind of play with that a little bit. Sorry, I should be scrolling through this zine as I talk, but here's a front cover. You can get a copy of it through our shop, right, Julian? I think so.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's free. But there's a bit of a preamble. But essentially what we did was we created fictions and actual photographs of the real world and put them together in a kind of slight predominantly observational technique, but also a way to say it's hard to draw a line between fiction and fact right now because the world is so volatile and changing so quickly. So that kind of, we wanted to play in that space. So I can just sort of scroll through, and interspersed in here are photographs that we each took of these sort of strange ad hoc signs that if the Near Future Laboratory had produced them a year ago would have been kind of interesting pieces of design fiction, or, you know, good photoshops, but are actually images of the real world. And the world is changing so quickly, it means that our understood library of archetypes is changing just as quickly. And it's sort of, you know, the phrase insufficient now to stand on makes it harder to predict the future. And the now is so radically changing all the time, from COVID piñatas to cubicle gyms. I think if I just scroll forward very quickly to the one which started all of this, sorry if this is not presenting very well, but this one on the right, you know, this is the kind of thing that Julian or Nicholas or I would have cooked up in a meeting to say, you know, there's all this talk about robots and they're all on YouTube, but they're not really in the real world. But this is actually a real poster from a Singapore park, you know, deploying robots to make sure people are socially distant. Feels like the kind of thing that would come out of Julian's mouth in one of our conversations, but it's a real thing. And so the zine is just a collection of all of those observations to help recalibrate or re-understand what our kind of, we use this phrase new normal a lot, but it really has an effect when you're trying to tell futures about the story if everybody's current existence and current ephemera is changing so radically and so quickly. It makes it harder to make subtle or notice subtle changes. So yeah, that's it. It's a collection of those things. There's a few kind of funny jokes in there, but just interesting to see the things that end up being doubled and tripled in price when a pandemic hits. Dumbbells, bread makers, outdoor jacuzzis, webcams, and trestle tables, it seems. But yeah, just a collection of images essentially with a few fictions thrown in to try and play in this space. It was a nice quick project, just grabbed from all of our hard drives basically and collated together. So yeah, feel free to download a copy. It's a little, there's a bit of friction in the download, but we're working on that. There you go.
Good stuff. Yeah, the thing that I'm still, I continue to kind of puzzle over with this, and it's a great kind of provocation and prompt to think through some stuff. Aside from just being like a fun kind of collection of things, is that relationship between, I guess, what's the relationship between like our, with humility, like the Near Future Laboratory's special sauce, which is the ability to think of provocative, oftentimes like humorous but productively humorous things that we might see in some kind of future world, and the fact that many of these things came to pass during this like profound inflection point. Like I'm trying to understand, not because I don't believe it, but I'm trying to understand like what's to be learned from that, and how does that become like a way in which we kind of like talk about the work that we do and the importance of it, and the ability to kind of, come up with a quote unquote, like, use case is the wrong word, but like a possible experience. So, park patrol by robots, and have someone be like, nah, that's not going to happen. But we do it to provoke that, to say like, okay, you might think that, but it might. And what are the circumstances under which it would happen? And what do we want, how can we engage in that possible future to either, be cautionary about it coming to pass, or to be prepared for it, or to, all those kinds of things. Like, what is going on here in the zine? Like, what do we take away and learn from it? I'm not saying that there's nothing there, but I'm saying, how do we articulate it? That thing that you started with Nick, just about, yeah, I don't know. There's something in that space that I'm still trying to understand, because I think it's incredibly useful and powerful. I'm not sure exactly what it is still. You know what I mean? That was a bit of a ramble. Like, does it take like a global pandemic to actually do the kind of work that the Near Future Laboratory does? Do we say like, hey, actually, it's easier to just come to us than it is to like have a global pandemic and experience it? We'll tell you what it's going to be like. What's going on?
Yeah, first infect 1 million people, then begin your design fiction project. Yeah, I understand. I think it's I mean, as with all of these things, in the doing, it opens up more questions. The original intent of this was just, there were a lot of crazy signs around, and the news felt like it was fiction, and wanted to sort of start recording that. But I think that's the joy of doing a project like this, is actually getting stuff together, and also firing up yourself and Nicholas and Fabian and Simone and Isra and all the sort of extended family. You start to build these theses around, actually, yeah, the reason why this feels like a piece of Near Future Laboratory design fiction maybe means that we've been getting something right. But also the bigger question of like, it's really hard to make a subtle statement when the world is so changeable, like the things that we've taken as normal, because, I've got this thing here, might as well. So you start with a can of tomatoes, or tomatoes, as I would say, and then you make subtle changes to tell stories about the future. Then making subtle changes about things when this thing is incredibly volatile and changeable and sort of ridiculous, means that those little nuances are really hard to do, because the thing you're trying to build upon is changing, and shops are boarding up and mandating strange behavioral norms and forcing you to wear masks and forcing you to do this, and I just think that makes our job a little trickier. Was where I came into this from.
But can you talk more about the volatility? Like, how do you know it's volatile? Is that part of the value of what you're doing, is understanding that it actually is volatile versus intractable?
Yeah, I guess I might be using the term volatile incorrectly, but it felt like there was massive amounts of change in weeks, not just on a kind of my local store put up signs that seemed very strange and everyone had to change their behavior, but Venice ran blue and the skies above Beijing went clear, and all these other crazy things that were seemingly like our understood sense of normality that we were then building futures on top of was starting to break apart and become different, and working patterns, everything seemed to be, and this sort of really overused term, the new normal, is kind of, I guess, what we were digging into a bit with some of this as we start to collect it together. It's like, how do you make, you know, all good science fiction feels like an extrapolation of the current, but if the current is so either odd in itself or changing by the day, it becomes harder to build kind of believable stories on top of it, because the foundations aren't solid, you know.
I see this zine as being very important and interesting in that it isolates some of the more, like you said, mundane but pervasive aspects of the changes. You know, everybody sees the headlines, everybody sees the statistics and things like that, but the squalid reality of day-to-day life is the thing that I think design fiction sort of educates us on. And I think that the examination of these things, it's kind of the collision of those large sort of narrative arcs with kind of actually more quantitative aspects of life being kind of plucked out and kind of presented for the viewer. And so I like that.
Yeah, I think I agree, obviously, because you gave us a compliment. But maybe one of the things, you know, my obsession in telling the future has been about the mundanity of the future and how infrequently that's done. And, you know, we were experiencing a once in a lifetime, hopefully, once in a generation, big event, you know, be it a technological headline, or in this case, a biological headline. It was a big change. And yet very quickly, the stories were about toilet paper and haircuts. And I just think that's a really good lesson for anyone whose job it is to explore and help clients explore the future is, yes, there will be big, huge kind of at a government and political level change, but the way that people will experience it will be, well, can I go to church? Or like, how do I get hold of kitchen cleaner if I'm only allowed one bottle a week? You know, all this very ordinary storytelling about the future. This was a really good example of that. It was a huge global event, and yet very quickly the conversations became, you know, well, can I get flour? You know, why can't I buy flour? You know, and I think that's just a good lesson in how to tell well-grounded, good, hooky stories about the future for people, is to just think about the mundanity of it all.
Also, to add something, Nick, I do think it's also interesting because one of the recurring topic in the zine is the notion of limits. It's limiting people's behavior, and in general, this limit comes from like institutions, but here, like any kind of shop or company has to make people understand that the behavior should be limited somehow. And the way it's expressed with signs, with duct tape, with a crappy kind of contraption. I mean, it's kind of intriguing to see how limits can be explained, how they can be enforced sometimes, and how they can lead to certain, I mean, forms of expressions, materially speaking, or the kind of emotion we might have looking at some of those pictures. And in a world in which like the whole discourse about innovation is about like moving fast, breaking things, it's fascinating to see how limiting the way we behave can be explained or expressed. And that's something that I'm fascinated about. Like all those numbers, like maximum 1, or you have to wear a mask here, just takes the essential things. It's kind of curious in a world of abundance, of course, and here it's expressed. So that's something again that a year ago we would not have taken that seriously, and here it is, and that's very intriguing.
Yeah, there's maybe, as speaking as a designer, there's also an interesting evolution of the quality of production over time. You know, the first week it was literally pieces of crappy paper with a marker pen, and then somebody printed something out on their own like logo paper, and then now, you know, it's all proper vinyls on the outside of trains, and it's become part of the high quality produced world that we live in. But there was this period of time when it really felt like, nailing a piece of wood across the door kind of emergency actions to stop people buying 20 packets of toilet paper. But it's become part of the sort of regular embedded infrastructure of life now, as the quality of production's caught up with the message that they want to say. Just kind of just a slightly meta or a fragment of what you were describing, but yeah.
I was struck by the work from that Second Story up in Portland has been doing around adaptive architecture. That they have a whole service line. It's on secondstory.com/adapt, because they had said, okay, first stage is the duct tape and boards nailed across. Then there's like, okay, so we polish it up and we do vinyl and this, it looks a little bit sleeker. But they're proposing that there's a third stage, which is you actually start re-engineering the processes. Instead of having people wait in line 6 feet apart, you're like, well, book your spot in line online, right? So you don't stand in line. You're sitting in your car or you're at home instead of standing in line, which is an interesting approach. They've gone and looked beyond the normalization of the signage and sort of just professionalizing the duct tape to moving forward to actually changing processes and services.
It's funny how a bunch of these look like Archigram projects today.
Yeah.
This outdoor dining dome is particularly interesting.
Or the gym cubicle reminds me of the Sutaloon.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right. Yeah, this one. Sorry. I'm getting there. This guy.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes, fun stuff.
Yeah, it was good. It was a fun, quick little project, and it's all, also one of those things that, back to our first conversation about new modes of working, it was just incredibly, just that kind of that network of people coming together. I mean, we work together every so often, essentially everyone, but it was just easy, just kind of drop things off and in a folder someplace, and then Nick did the work of essentially laying it out. And then also, the one thing I found actually quite challenging was the truth is stranger than fiction. It's like there's very little, I guess, design fiction in here. It's design fiction, it's weird stuff, but there's very little. There are very little things that we just kind of made up.
Yeah, I mean, this picture on the right is a fabrication that doesn't exist. That's a Photoshop, but you wouldn't know because it sits next to other things that seem equally unusual or sort of slightly strange. But if we'd have produced that a year ago, it would have felt like, well, why is that? Who's doing that? What happened? I think the fact that Julian and Nicholas and I have all said slightly different things about this project, I really like that. That we've all we've noticed some stuff happening and we've collected it all together and we've made a thing, and in the making of the thing, that's what actually helps concretize ideas for each of us, but they're not necessarily the same ideas, or because it's not this one coalition of truth about what we've observed, and we've all brought our own sort of interests in it, but we all think there's something there. And I think the act of, I mean, you all know this on the call, I'm sure, but like the act of actually doing something is enough sometimes to make it become something in your brain, as opposed to having a loose conversation and never quite trying to drill down into it. What's that phrase, Julian? Less yammer, more hammer.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Nick, do you want to talk? Should we talk for a minute about 100 Pixel?
Yeah, sure. When you say we.
Yeah. So as I mentioned it in the UFusion Laboratory website certificate is out of date. Okay, I'm going to send that to Edgar in IT. He'll take care of that. Thank you. Thanks for that, David. Yeah, so the way I've been talking about it, and trying to get my head around it, because I feel like 100 Pixel is one of these things where it's like, we have like a fairly decent kind of conceptualization of what it's meant to be, and we'll kind of figure it out as we're sort of building it. And it's like the number one marker for a particular way of working that oftentimes happens at the Near Future Laboratory, and especially with myself and Nick, is that we'll put a shingle out and then figure out what the service actually is. And the way in which I imagine, with the way it happened with this, is like Nick was like, "Hey, I've got this domain name."
That's very true.
What should go on the website? And yeah, so Nick, it's part of the story, and I think it's so important for especially this thing. So Nick had a website, 100 Pixel, which was absolutely brilliant. I thought, this was his $1 billion gig, back after the studio that we were at, wound down, and Nick was going to use his remarkable kind of design skills to help translate earnest entrepreneurs' ideas into like really articulate, legible, beautiful, supple, alluring pitch decks, essentially. And I was like, that's fucking brilliant. Like, that's a thing. And it turns out that is a thing, because I talked to another friend. I talked to Patrick, Nick and Nicholas, yesterday on a call, and Patrick was talking about like someone he knows who does that, who's like, it's actually a good racket. And it's called 100 Pixel, and it's just enviable level of kind of design skill and just an eye for like making these things, translating ideas into something sharp and focused. And that then Nick got a Normal Human job, and so that domain name, I guess, kind of stalled out. And then the domain name was there, and was like, well, let's use this domain name, and then kind of pour this idea that we had been kind of batting around and experimenting with probably for years, to find out how design fiction can fit into the world of visual storytelling, so cinema. And I really like that for a bunch of reasons, but one of the main reasons is because I realize, if I think back, like the idea of design fiction kind of evolved and developed while I was teaching in the School of Cinematic Arts at USC. So like like a really significant kind of institute that is also significantly corrupt, but there you go, that produces lots and lots of remarkable graduates who go on to like kind of amazing careers in filmmaking. And while I was there, it's like when I was kind of sort of formulating and kind of understanding like what's the relationship between the visual representation of idea in the form of like a prop or a bit of an element that appears on screen, and how effective and powerful that can be. And I was also, as you guys know, it's like a time when I was becoming much more acquainted and friendly with Bruce Sterling, and we were having these like kind of discussion groups and all this kind of stuff where it was coming out. And then David Kirby kind of came across my desk, and his work on lab coats in Hollywood, how kind of like technical consultants play a role in actually translating potentially complicated ideas into these things in films that actually bring things together, hold things together. So, my first kind of broad instinct was like, hey, is there a way in which we can use these kinds of tools to help tell stories more in the kind of like, I guess, kind of commercial design context? So is this another arrow in the quiver of translating ideas about possible future products or services or experiences using these particular techniques that happen to be really effective in when you have a good story and a good production, that can you do that in the commercial design world? And now it feels like we're almost kind of coming back the other way to say like, hey, we've done a bunch of stuff over here. We're actually well informed and kind of like nicely networked in the world of kind of technology and design and all the things that go on in there. Are there ways in which we can help inform the way in which a visual story is told that is maybe more effective than would be if you didn't have this kind of resource. So that's how I've been thinking about it. And there was like we played around with it with Green Pages, which is around here someplace, which was our first kind of foray into like what are, is there a resource guide, a kind of almanac that would be of use within the film industry to say like, hey, here's a compendium of all these, kind of remarkable kind of buzzwords of technology, but filled in, the gaps are kind of filled in so that you understand, where it came from, what kind of resources, almost like a resource guide, I still think of it as like a farmer's almanac in a way of interesting, possibly real, but also maybe there's not quite real things in there, but they still become effective elements that could potentially come into play in the production of a film. So I need to sharpen that pitch, eh, Nick?
I think it's a good pitch. And for recruiting a workforce, I think that pitch is more than adequate. It sounds like you're going to need a lot of resources to implement these ideas. And I think that the pitch that you've delivered so far is more than enough to get a lot of people on board. So.
Yeah, I think we've had a few conversations already, and it's been surprisingly positive. I always felt that, there's it's not an apocryphal tale, it's a real tale of Minority Report bringing together experts from science, real design, real futurists to brainstorm and build that stuff. But from what we understand, that happens surprisingly little and infrequently. Or if it's just a friend of a production designer or a friend of a director, producer, showrunner, that kind of happens a bit. But if you're making a medical drama, like one of the people that you hire is a medical expert. If you're making one of the best analogies we've had so far is if you're making a period drama and the period is the 30s, you get exactly the right Heinz label bottle, you get exactly the right clothes, the language they use, the cigarettes they smoke, the clock on the wall, all the microscopic, mundane details you have to get right. But if that period is 2052, it's just like, fuck it, we'll just make it up. And that seems like that's a good opportunity for people that have spent a long time in the world of real science, real technology, storytelling, helping companies understand what that world could be like, understanding the trajectories of interaction design and technology and all these other things, to just come along and help you make that world feel more grounded, more realistic, more believable, more engrossing, interesting. It's been pretty positive so far. Lots of people seem to be really interested in it, and I think at the moment it's kind of left up to production design teams, which is why there's sort of, I don't mean to be too disparaging, but the kind of lazy tropes of the future appear so regularly in the movies, and we're interested in trying to work on projects that are trying to tell stories about the future as a continuation of the present, as opposed to something completely different. And I think we can add something there. So Fabian, very VP-like, said it's cinema as a vertical. It's quite that.
You know where I see those same issues too. It's in those corporate concept videos that a big telco will be like life in 2030, and some of them are so badly thought out. You can tell that there's no connection with the actual R&D organization, or that they'd been working on something that they needed to shoehorn into the video.
Yeah, or there's some sort of CES deliverable that they need to get on a big plasma screen.
I was watching one the other.
The thing, so Julian and I have also been talking about there's this sort of diagram that I guess everybody holds of like science fiction, science fact, real investment, real product, science fiction. Like there's this kind of nice diagram that people draw, but actually it all goes in all directions. Like everyone's influencing each other all the time in all directions. And Julian and I were just like, well, why don't we play with pushing our arrow the other way a bit for fun in 100 Pixel? And like, actually, what if we went back to film and said, hey, we've got this stuff, and it turns out they're really interested in the stuff that we do and the things that we know. So it's easy to draw that nice diagram of like what influences each other, but actually it all goes in every direction. And it was just an opportunity to explore that a little.
Yeah, there was one thing that has stuck with me since we had our last kind of standing 100 pixel meeting last week or whatever, Nick, was this idea of just be more thorough about every element of your production, and maybe that you're not really being when it comes to these elements that we're talking about, and that could be reason enough that someone might want to engage 100 pixel. It's like we just do better, rather than, again, not to be disparaging to production designers, but there's probably a component of it where it's they just do sort of what they think should be done, but they're really, they're master craftsmen when it comes to like carpentry, or like doing beautifully exquisite detailing for a pump action laser rifle, but they're not asking like, do we need a pump action laser rifle? They're like, I guess we should have a pump action laser rifle in this
I
future.
think that they're asking the wrong question. And it's like material science might change fundamentally in how we approach a lot of these subjects. I think that's like where you might be able to contribute a lot more. You have the ability to recruit subject matter experts that can not just work off these tropes to the future, but really look at them and say, okay, if we're going to have carbon nanotubes, what are the repercussions of that? Do we even have spaceships anymore? Or do we only default to space elevators, or maybe rockets are more niche? Like, how does that change the entire storyline of a space drama? How does that change the entire, like struggle for political power in that narrative? I think that we're just not even accounting for those really base progressions in technology.
Yeah, I think as with every kind of, and I guess this is kind of a consulting gig that we're trying to set up, being very clear about what it is you do and how you do it is important. And I think we're still wrestling with that a little bit. And one of the things is like help at the very earliest pre-greenlit stage, like describe the story and describe the main hooks and MacGuffins in it. But also it could just be, like you say, finding an expert for somebody. We've worked in our sort of day jobs with some of the best people in emerging science and technology, and they don't really interface very much with Hollywood. And if you need someone, we can maybe help you find someone. But there's stuff in the middle as well, which is like, there's a scene here. Maybe there's a screenplay already, and there's a scene where somebody has to steal something of importance from a big company, for example. And we can help make that more rounded by thinking, well, what would be important to a company in the future? Hard drive is kind of, maybe not important, but maybe something else. Or there's a scene where somebody takes some drug, and figuring out what the mechanism for them to take that drug could be by referring back to what we know is going on in drug delivery techniques. And maybe it's a patch, maybe it's a thing up the nose, maybe it's actually an electronic device. Like those moments, and trying to figure out what it is. If somebody came to us and says, yes, I'm in, so what do you do? I think that's the phase that we're in at the moment, is just trying to very clearly sort of say, these are the kinds of things we could assist with. As you can tell, it's in its formative weeks, but so far the conversations we've had with studios and screenwriters and other people have been really, really interesting.
You need to define this new term, I think, that's like this exploratory artifact that is a critical plot component, and that there needs to be a new terminology, new language to communicate this to directors and the artistic functionaries within this community, to explain exactly how that critical insight is going to deliver that plot component or something like that. Also limits of how much that can be fleshed out, or how little it needs to be fleshed out to really be effective in the story. I think will always be like a great determination. Because, the close-up of the phaser is only so interesting the first time. The second time, it's less interesting. People start to develop these mental constructs of these imaginary objects, how they might function. Similar to how you model light switches function next to a light bulb.
Yeah.
That's more extrapolated.
Well, one of the things that I've been, maybe we're at time, I don't know, Julian, but one of the things I've been thinking about is, the Hitchcock phrase, the MacGuffin, which is like the thing around which the story pivots. There needs to be a different word for the stuff that I'm interested in, which is kind of like the opposite, which is all the stuff around the story that makes the story better. So like the tins of food, like this is a prop we made. but like antiviral, where are we going? Antiviral pasta sauce, for example. It wouldn't be the gold bar that someone's trying to steal at the center of the story, but it could be half a second of a shot on a shelf as the protagonist walks by, which just makes you embed yourself that little bit more in their world, and it makes the director look like they've given a shit about the story they're telling. Sorry, but like finding a language for those countless other little bits of care and storytelling that go around a story. Again, in Minority Report, in a talk that I've given numerous times, there's all of the kind of forefront technology stuff, the swoopy swipey, the cars that go sideways, all that stuff. But there's a moment when he has a cereal box with an animated front, which is like an e-ink or something animated, and he picks it up and eats out of it and puts it down, and that action is supposed to stop the animation, but it doesn't work, and so he swings it across the room, and it's over in a second. But for me, that sort of picture of the future where the technology is kind of incredible, you know, we've got animated color screens down to the price where they go on packaging, but it's broken a bit and it doesn't always work perfectly. It's actually kind of an annoyance. And it's not a central part of the story. You could leave that scene out. Minority Report would still be Minority Report without it. But the fact that it's in there and there's that little moment, it's like, oh, this person's thought about the future in its kind of fully rounded manifestation. And I think that's the stuff I'm really interested in trying to do.
How would you deal with situations where there's something that is far-fetched and inconsistent, but is actually really central to the plot? You know, do you think there's an opportunity to work closely with screenwriters at the early stage instead of like having it be part of the set dressing?
Yeah, I mean, we're learning about Hollywood. It's a very strange place, and we've not been in it very long. And there's also a slight sort of boyhood fantasy thing about this. We've got to be honest. Julian's got this thing. He'll do anything if somebody will give him a bullhorn and an orange jacket on a film set. You know, just being around filmmaking would be interesting, and we're learning about it a lot. And it has its own language and its own weird ways of working. It's like 98% promise, 2% action, I think. You know, $100 million things can get cancelled overnight. You know, it's a very flighty, weird, odd space. And I guess a lot of movies are built off books being optioned and stories that already exist in some form being converted into movies. And the opportunity for change in those things is limited, right? Because the story's already kind of there, the narrative arc is kind of there. But there are movies that are created from scratch, and maybe the work that we could do or the input that we could have could be different in those kinds of movies. And the other part of this, to be really honest, is TV. You know, TV is different than it was 10 years ago. And actually, if you're doing a movie in 90 minutes, the opportunity to have a lingering shot on something like this is low. But if you've got to produce 10 hours of a series like Westworld or something, you need stuff like this to fill the time. You know, you need to make the world feel rounded. You're making a 10-hour movie, so it has to feel well considered. And it could be that working for the Netflix type studios or the Amazon studios could yield more opportunity in a kind of serial than it would in a movie. But I consider them kind of hugely overlapping. But the density of storytelling that comes from TV is interesting.
Another idea that occurs to me is that you could possibly start deriving story ideas from some of these background elements and come up with a catalog of story dynamics that you can market, not just say, oh, in this world, here are some interesting background objects, but start with a series of background objects, which is, I guess, is what Near Future Laboratories does. And tell the story of the thing and market a series of story ideas. You know, I was looking the other day at the newsstand in Blade Runner for Blade Runner, the movie. They had these newsstands and they actually made mock magazine covers to go in the newsstand. And each of those potentially was a story in itself.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something in that. And we were, one of the people we spoke to shared a thing called the Stranger Things Bible. And it was this sort of fake produced magazine book cover thing, which had sort of moments from the film. And like, it wasn't quite what you're describing, but I totally agree. Like, you could build a film premise off a fake can of food. Does the person work in this factory? Do they, is this the only food left on Earth, or whatever? You know, like there's a ton of opportunity there, and I guess we're open to anything at the moment just to explore it. But it's kind of, we are treating it as a bit of fun, and it is part of the Near Future Laboratory. It's part of what we do, and it's just slightly different branding just to try and eke into this world a little bit.
Sounds like a dream scenario. Yeah, if there's any way I can form part of an extended network, that'd be great.
Sure. I mean, that's the thing. Like, funny, like what Julian said is like, the only thing stopping you from doing it is doing it. So we'll start doing it. If it starts to happen, then hey, we worked out. We're both really interested in films. We both think there's something useful there. And hey ho, it turns out people seem to think the same. So
I just wanted to quickly say, I happen to work at Disney Animation Studio. I was an interaction designer during Frozen and Big Hero 6. And so I worked mainly with the story team, designing tools for them, and like animators and lighters and a lot of stuff, but a lot with the story team. So I don't know, you wouldn't get a bullhorn, Julian, in feature animation, or you could, but it wouldn't really matter. Maybe if it was mocap bullhorn, that would help. But so I don't know if you're just looking at live action or not, but I was just thinking through the pipeline. There's like 30 different jobs in feature animation, at least in the Disney Pixar pipeline, the Disney one I'm familiar with. The story would definitely be, if you want the artifacts, the design fiction to be more central to the story team would be a good spot to introduce it, because everything else is downstream from that. But then there's a couple of the other just modeling pipeline portions where like people that just like, they really just model props. That's their main job, all kinds of props. And that's everything, every little thing that gets snuck in there. It just helps fill out the world building through like the 1,000 things, the soda cans, everything, like the stuff you're holding up, the food can. And it just, people might notice it for half a second, but sometimes people notice that and pause it and look at it and study it. So there's a few different, at least in feature animation pipeline, there's a couple different spots. Story would be the biggest one, because like Disney Animation Studio, for example, does not take scripts. They don't take outside stories. They're all director-led, generated stories. It's not adaptation at all, but just to throw that out there.
that's really, really, maybe we could have a chat in a separate session. I'd love to learn more about that.
Yeah, it'd be great.
Thank you.
How about video games? A lot of video games now have a very, very strong narrative elements, and that's a place where, you know, someone playing the game can like pick up your prop and spend quite a lot of time looking around at it. I'm thinking, you know, Death Stranding, Horizon Zero Dawn. I mean, the plots and the artifacts in the games are actually very, very fleshed out.
Yeah, for sure. And they have a lot of physical space to fill and also time to fill. So.
Yep. And in some cases, they're starting from like a game dynamic. Oh, this is, you know, a MOBA, you know, with FPS dynamics and a quest, but we need to fill it out as a story. So there could be an opportunity there.
The major change, I would say, on that front definitely comes in graphic processing and allocation of resources. And this is like very, very loosely based off of like resource talk of like how do you allocate jobs to people. But definitely we're seeing with, you know, the newest generations of like video game like graphics engines, you know, the ability to import like full raw assets. You know, so it could be even like photogrammetry scans or dimensional scans of creating a boss or an animal or whatever detail you need in the world. But we're now starting to develop game engines which can dumb down a raw model without memory limitations. Whatever processor is able to then display an adequate image that approximates the raw data, meaning that you can bring in a raw 3D scan of goat, and maybe one person may perceive that as a bunch of, you know, blocky architecture kind of thing. Another person may see it true to life as a real goat, how high performance the hardware is, and that's going to completely change asset development, because up until this point, people have written these stories and written these objects into video games with this knowledge and understanding that the asset itself has to be limited in memory capacity to be displayed on the screen properly. So there's like limitations of complexity of like animation and interaction with the component and like that. that just seems like it's going to really change over the next year or two.
Mhm.
And just the beginning of this year is really when this has been possible. And yeah, and also the growth of parametric modeling, which I brought up before in these discussions, I think will deepen that story element of an object where, right now the idea of parametric design is maybe a lamp that changes height. Perhaps that could be tied to much more of a abstract qualia, such as some other component in the game that changes, that affects a much larger network of decisions that then alter an end artifact, you could say, that's a plot element in the story. But it's about devising these complicated interactions that then algorithmically derive the game from there. And I think we're going to see more and more of that.
I've seen some fun examples of the reverse path too, where something that was built for a game was sufficiently well thought out that it was then executed in real life. I mean, the one I've seen recently is the jacket that one of the characters wears in Death Stranding was so well thought out that Errolson Hughes from Acronym then went and made the jacket in real life. It's impossible to get like everything from Acronym, but he actually made the jacket and it's very, very functional. I remember seeing also the Warthog vehicle from Halo was built in real life, and it was at the Peterson collection in LA for a while, and it was drivable and surprisingly functional.
Another way to look at this could be also, a lot of filmmakers, video game makers are looking at these sort of multi-platform extensions of their worlds. So you could actually build out a larger world which won't necessarily appear on the screen, but in other interactions or experiences that you could create out of them. So it becomes almost part of the mythology of that world. Marvel does it a lot with a lot of their sort of movies, but you could do that like these offshoot comic books or games.
Yeah, I like that. I like that extension. I think the Matrix was the first movie to have a website, and their website had loads of other stuff. You could apply to work in the company and all that kind of stuff. I think that's a really good observation, actually.
Yeah, transmedia. And as David points out, you could potentially be using the same digital assets that were used to actually make the film to make a game. You could use exactly the same assets. But the transmedia point is actually really, really cool, Nancy. That's a really interesting idea. Westworld was really good at that too, where there were websites that were artifacts from the series in effect.
They also did that whole immersive experience at South by Southwest a couple of years ago, which was an extension. Yeah. So they did the extra storytelling there. They built Westworld in the desert in Texas, and flew a bunch of people out there to actually have a Westworld experience. So stuff like that is actually increasing. I mean, it's kind of come to almost a standstill because of the current pandemic, but there's still really interesting ways in which you could explore that. So I don't know if you guys have seen this, but recently the fashion designer J.W. Anderson, he did this fashion show in a box. Really interesting concept where he just sort of literally sent people a small sort of a shoebox kind of a thing with storytelling assets in it. And that was his fashion show. I can link it in the chat, but it's definitely worth looking at stuff like that as well.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone.
There's the Westworld experience case is super interesting. There's a podcast, I'll paste the link, where they interviewed the actors who participated in that, who basically pointed out that, look, people knew that this was fake and they were real people, but they still treated the actors like robots and became very brutal. It was such a convincing experience that, people actually acted as if it really were Westworld.
There's that secret cinema thing as well. They do. I think that they do a lot of those in the UK, where they sort of have the film, but then they create the environment around them as well. It's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your thoughts as usual and comments. We'll see you next week, I guess.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Nice to see you.